Hi, good morning. My name is Beau Rogers, and I'm representing Creation Ministries International, or CMI. Pastor Smith, thank you so much for inviting me into your church today. I've already gotten this question a few times this morning. What is Creation Ministries International? Well, we're unique. We're a donor-funded apologetics ministry. Now, I am not here to teach you guys how to apologize. All the husbands in the room, we should be very good at that already. No, apologetics means defending your faith with logical and credible answers to sometimes very tough questions. The mission of CMI is to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, equip believers to defend the faith and the authority of the Bible, with specific emphasis on the Genesis account. We have 7 offices worldwide, and we employ more Bible-based PhD scientists than any other organization that we're aware of. Now, I'm not going to ask for anyone to raise their hands, especially this early in the morning, but how many of you have encountered these questions when you're sharing your faith, or have these questions yourself? Questions like, why would a loving God allow so much death and suffering? Why should I believe the Bible if evolution is a scientific fact? Did God really create in 6 days? Is there science in the Bible? Did we evolve from 8 men? Where do dinosaurs fit in the Bible? So again, I'm not asking you to raise your hand, but have you been challenged by these questions? What if your son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter came home from school and asked you these same questions? Would you have an answer? Well, that's why Creation Ministries exist. I'm here today to give you just a taste of the wealth of information that's available to help you answer these very tough questions and disciple the next generation of believers. Now, a little bit more about me. I'm a bit of a science nerd and an adrenaline junkie. I went to the United States Air Force Academy for college. I was a skydiving instructor there, and I graduated in a degree of aeronautical engineering. After I graduated, I served for 23 years in the active duty as an F-16 pilot. I went to Top Gun school and was later a Top Gun instructor. Now, I try not to spill the coffee. I'm a Delta pilot, but I still have some fun. And on the side, I do some part-time work as a Porsche driving coach. Now, none of that is important as the fact that I have a wife and we just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. And we have 2 boys, 19 and 21, both off in college. So you can see I've done some pretty fun things. However, nothing gets me as excited as being able to come here and defend the gospel and share this with you guys. Now, as a father, especially with kids in college, I am very concerned about the recent statistics of our youth leaving the church. The Barna Institute did a confidential survey of Christian teens and found that 2/3 intend to stop attending church after they leave the home. They primarily cited that it was because of the bombardment of the counter-biblical teaching of evolution in the classroom and in the media. Now, CMI went out and did our own research. We sent a film crew to the university campuses in Atlanta, and the results are recorded in our documentary that we have on a DVD called Fallout. So as students walked past, we eventually talked to 100 of them who grew up in the church. Now, our research paints a more dire picture than even what the Barna study said. 94% of the church-going youth had quit going to church after leaving the home. Simply raising kids in church was not enough. Now, 6 of the 100 were still attending church, and this is notable. 5 of them had some type of biblical creation truths taught to them. All 5 that had been taught about biblical creation were still attending church. So there is some good news. The greatest barriers to accepting the Christian faith were cited as science refutes the Bible and the refusal to believe in fairy tales. You see, this idea of evolution is a major influence affecting today's youth and also many otherwise potential believers. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." Now, is this a suggestion? No, it's not. It is a command. You see, our culture is in a battle for the truth, and deception is the devil's greatest weapon. Now, would we deploy our young pilots to combat without the proper training? Absolutely not. But are we properly prepared for spiritual battle. See, the Boy Scout motto is be prepared. And in the fighter squadron, we said that we fight like we train, so train well. Well, similarly, CMI is about equipping you with the tools to strengthen your faith for spiritual battle. Now, how can you find us? Well, I'm in the military, so asked to keep it pretty simple, and it is. Creation.com. You may want to write that down in case you want to remember it, and there will be a test. Creation.com. Now, you can go to our website and you can probably find answers to some of your really tough questions. We have 40 years of creation research at your fingertips. Most likely, your answer is already waiting for you. And I use the search feature all the time myself. You can also take us with you on your phone or in your tablet. InfoBytes is CMI's free email newsletter, and it'll get sent to you on a weekly basis. It's a great way to stay up to date on the latest biblical information on science and God's creation. It's also a great evangelism tool, as you can simply forward InfoBytes to your family and friends. Now, normally you can't use your phone in church, but today you can break those suckers out and you can scan the QR code, and that will take you to our website where you can sign up for CMI's InfoBytes. Or you can do it old school way, and we'll have some volunteers going throughout with clipboards, and you can sign up with the old-fashioned pen and paper. Just make sure your email is very legible. Now, you may have seen the bookstore display as you walked in today. This is in response to years of church members asking us to bring resources with us. Remember, CMI is an equipping ministry for your church and community. So we're a faith-funded ministry, so it's not about the book sales, but this vital information cannot be accessed at schools or local libraries, which is why we're making our resources available to you today. Again, you are why our ministry exists. CMI visits churches, and we make over 1,200 of these presentations annually. We're the largest worldwide creation ministry. Our flagship resource is our magazine. It's a quarterly magazine, and it's in over 110 countries now. We have over 14,000 articles on our website. We have YouTube videos, books, and movies. So there's literally something for everybody. Now, I have not always been a Bible-believing, Genesis is the word-for-word truth creationist, and I'm sure I can relate to everyone here. So, like much of today's youth, I grew up as an evolutionist, although I went to church and Sunday school. Just like the survey revealed, I heard the Bible stories on Sunday, but I learned about facts and science on Monday through Friday. Now imagine that my science teacher and my Sunday school teacher were the same person. So when the Bible and my science class conflicted, I just assumed that the school textbooks were right, and I was nearly a statistic. But in my teens, the gospel message was compelling, and I became a Christian, but I still held on to my millions of years evolutionary timeline belief, despite what the Bible clearly says. So does this resonate with anybody here? Have you heard the idea that God created the universe and our world via the Big Bang 13 billion years ago, and then guided the evolutionary process to where we are today? Well, this combining of worldviews is called theistic evolution, and it doesn't work. The problem is that the Bible does not leave any room for millions of years. Now, I figured that with more studying, I'd eventually find the answers, but no one had any answers for me. Well, obviously something changed or I wouldn't be here. When I retired from the Air Force, I connected with CMI and its resources, and I am now confident that the Bible is right and is trustworthy from the beginning to the end. You see, the media likes to portray the issue as science versus the Bible, as if the two are mutually exclusive. But that's not at all true. We love science, and I'll be discussing how operational science overwhelmingly supports the Bible. So a little bit about science. Did you know that there's two types of sciences? And it's worth understanding the difference. We have operational and historical science. So operational science is what I am an avid user of. Most of my life is based on sound, logical, operational science. It's given us computers, modern medicine, space travel, your phone, all thanks to operational or experimental science. It's the scientific method that we learned in school. I use operational science at the racetrack. I continuously experiment with braking performance and traction, and then I'll make the adjustments that are necessary to go as fast as possible. As a fighter pilot, I use a scientific method to develop tactics based on new technology. We have an idea, go out and test it, and if it worked, we'd tell everybody else about it. If it didn't work, we'd try something else. And when you're operating at $10,000 an hour per airplane, and ultimately it's life and death, you have to get it right. Now, we trust operational science. In fact, flying a commercial airliner is safer than driving to church and back. Our biggest complaint that we get, in fact, is when the in-flight internet's slow. So yes, operational science works and is very trustworthy. It happens in the present. It's observable. You can see it, touch it, hear it. It's repeatable. Anybody can do the experiment and either verify it or falsify it. Now let's contrast that with historical or forensic science. So historical science is a person's interpretation of the past based on their existing presupposition or worldview. Again, it happened in the past, it's not observable, and it's not repeatable. You have to interpret the evidence that you have that's in the present and make up a plausible story of the event in the past. It's like being a detective or a CSI agent. You're trying to recreate a murder scene. To fill in the gaps of information, you have to bring in a lot of assumptions. And these assumptions you cannot directly test. So compared to operational science, historical science is underpinned by assumptions based on a worldview, and that dictates how we're going to interpret the evidence. In fact, modern science has taken on a worldview of naturalism. And naturalism says everything must be explained by natural processes. God cannot exist. Now, if you're excluding God in the Genesis account of creation when answering all of life's biggest problems or biggest questions, you are definitely not objective science. And this is a big deception. So operational science is objective, it's black and white. Historical science is subjective, and it uses unprovable assumptions shaped by worldviews. For example, if you believed that fish sprouted arms and legs and evolved into land mammals, can you test that? Can you do an experiment? Can you observe it or repeat it? No. So how do you know it's true? Well, we'll kind of dive into this. So what is this? That's right, it's a fossil. Does this fossil exist in the past or in the present? Well, it lived in the past, but we observe it only in the present. All evidence exists in the present. So when you dig up a fossil, it doesn't come with a label. The evidence does not speak for itself. It has to be interpreted. And that's where the two worldviews come into play. The creation science worldview says we use the Bible as a reliable eyewitness account as a starting point and use the past to explain the present. Evolution says we use the present and work backwards to explain the past, while patently rejecting the possibility of God. So quick short quiz, which worldview, evolution or creation, has the most evidence on how our world was created? Do we have different or the same fossils, DNA, rocks, what we see under the microscope or telescope? Well, we all have the same evidence, but they're interpreted through different worldviews. So the real question you have to ask is which worldview makes the most sense? And that's what we're going to explore. See, historical science interprets the evidence, and it is a bit like a courtroom. So there's two attorneys. We both have the same evidence and clues. Both attorneys are very biased. They're committed to their worldview, and they'll make compelling arguments. The naturalist will say, evolution in millions of years is correct. That's how we got to where we are today. The creation will say, no, it's the Bible, God's supernatural miracles and Noah's flood. That's the truth and better explains what we see today. Well, welcome to the Worldview Courtroom. You are the jury and so are your kids. Now, how can the jury, your son or daughter, make an informed decision if she only hears one side of the story? 1 to 2 hours of church on Sunday versus everything else Monday through Saturday. Well, I believe that we observe enough in the present to know that the Bible's true. But it is hard to get that message out. So let's explore why evolution and biblical creation cannot coexist. All right, most Christians find the genealogy list in the Bible as a sure cure for insomnia, and it will quickly put you to sleep. I get it. However, these genealogies are very powerful theological evidence that the earth is not millions of years old. See, the Bible gives us a reliable time span of 4,000 years from Adam to Jesus. And we get that with the biblical genealogies, the king's reigns, significant events. Basically, it's simple math, adding up all the data in the generations, and we get to this 4,000 years between Adam and Jesus. Now, we know the history after Jesus, that's a good another 2,000 years. So we're looking at 6,000 years total between Adam and present day. Now, of note, Noah's flood was about 2500 BC, or 4,500 years ago. So if we have this very tightly defined timeline of 6,000 years, where are we going to force millions of years? Generally, it's going to be before Adam, but that poses its own problem. You see, secular teaching says that all these rock layers equals millions of years. Now, what do we find in the rock layers? Well, we find fossils. And what are fossils? That's right, dead things. Now, I'm about to step on some toes. So therefore, if you try to put all those millions of years in front of Adam, that means that there's lots of death before Adam, before the fall, before sin. So going back to our courtroom example, both sides cannot be right. Let's see which one makes the most sense. Now, the Bible tells us that when God gave us the Ten Commandments, He reminded us that He made everything in just 6 days. And God saw all that He had made, it was very good. So before the fall, everything was very good. Adam and Eve are walking in the garden. This is before death, before any sin. There was one warning, and that is, you do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for if you do, you will surely die. So again, at this point, we're in paradise. Nothing bad's happened. If you want to fit those millions of years before Adam and Eve were created, then that means Adam and Eve would have been standing on a fossil graveyard of suffering, disease, and death. Now, I can't see God, who embodies the very nature of good, calling this very good. In fact, I would say it kind of makes God out to be a monster. So do we think that a perfect and loving God used millions of years of death and mutation as His mechanism to create His perfect world? No, absolutely not. And the Bible's clear on this as well. Romans 5:12 says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men because all sin. See, death was a direct result of Adam's sin, period. And further, the Bible teaches that all of creation is now groaning under the curse. And that includes sickness, disease, killing other animals for food, and things wearing out or decay. 1 Corinthians 15 says, for as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. You see, you can't understand the good news of the New Testament until you first understand the bad news in Genesis. I appeal to the jury. Should we take Genesis literally? Well, let's look through this logically. If death existed before sin, then death is not the payment for sin. If death is not the payment for sin, then Jesus' death does not pay our sin debt. So, salvation is directly and intractably linked to the literal story of Adam and Eve and their original sin. So should we take Genesis literally? Yes, absolutely. Now the atheists get it. They understand that belief in evolution logically eradicates the gospel message. This is Frank Zindler, an American atheist, and he said this in a debate against William Craig. The most devastating thing, though, that biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. Now that we know Adam and Eve never were real people, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. You see, the secular agenda is to eliminate God, and that should not surprise us. It's really a heart issue. You see, people don't want to be accountable to God. They don't want to be accountable to His absolute moral truth. 2 Timothy 4:3-4 says, "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths." This is a heart issue. Evolution's popularity is surprising, but it should not surprise us. The Bible predicted it. However, we need the tools to counter this evolutionary thinking and worldview to defend the truth in the Bible. Now, I get this a lot. Hey, Beau, if science supports the Bible so well, then why don't we hear about it? Can this many scientists all be wrong? And I agree, it's perplexing. I've always heard that science will follow the facts wherever it leads us, but now we have to include unless that points to God. So this is Dr. Todd, and he said, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, God, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. So again, this is a heart issue, not a head issue. But let's put this "there is no God" worldview to the test. We're going to play a game called Intelligent Design or Random Acts of Nature. And you are the jury. Let's find out which makes the most logical sense. So you're walking through the woods and you see this on the ground. What makes the most logical sense? Was this designed or did this happen by random chance in nature? Well, it's a wristwatch. Of course, we know there was a designer and it has a function. Now, let's say I completely disassembled this watch, stuck it in an isolated box, and shook it up for a day. Do you think I'd get a complete watch? What if I did it for 1,000,000 years? Exactly, it's not going to happen. Well, let's take an even simpler example. Growing up in South Georgia, after it rained, my dad would take me to plowed fields, and we would go look for special rocks. Do you see any special rocks? Yeah, you've got a black and a white arrowhead. You see, it is not that hard to recognize design versus something that just happened random in nature. It is really that simple, and it's easy. So with that in mind, why then, when we look into a microscope and we see DNA, which is the most dense and complex information storage system that we know of, more so than computers, or a nanomachine that spins flagella of an E. coli bacteria, or AT synthase machine, this is down at the molecular level, that no life can be sustained without it, and it's nearly 100% efficient. Why can we look at these through a microscope, things that are vastly more complicated than a watch or an arrowhead, and assume that it came by natural causes? Yet so many scientists, modern scientists, assume that these materialize by random chance without God creating them. It really is baffling. But the reason is because they patently refuse to allow for the existence of God. So this is Professor Lewontin, and he says, "We take the side of evolutionary science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism, moreover that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." See, we're taught that science is objective, but it is anything but objective as far as historical science is concerned, to the point of willfully denying the obvious for the sake of maintaining the millions of years worldview. Our culture and our public education deliberately only show us one side of the story. So please do not think that the science that we're exposed to is neutral. It is not. And CMI is here to equip believers and provide resources to demolish arguments that are set up against our kids and our culture that prevent them from knowing our Creator, Jesus Christ. So let's look at some real-world examples, and as if in a courtroom, let's have the Genesis story challenge the evolutionary worldview, and we'll see which one makes the most logical sense. Would you believe it or not, this is in America. This is my wife a little over 20 years ago, and we're at the Grand Canyon. Now, I was taught that these layers in the Grand Canyon took millions of years to form, and that's based on present observations. With very, very slow sedimentation, think about dust just covering your windshield in the morning. So that means when you look at the Grand Canyon, this is over 500 million years, over 500 million years of sedimentation. That's what they want you to believe. Now, did you know that there is overwhelming evidence that these massive layers were laid down rapidly by sediments and water, one after another in quick succession? Now, we find these rock layers across the entire globe, spanning continents, and guess what else we find inside these rock layers? Fossils, dead things. So, does the Bible record something that could give these results? Yes, Noah's worldwide flood. Now, I've heard there's not enough water to cover all the earth, including the mountains. Let's take a look at that. So check this out. We know that the earth itself, even today, is covered in 70% water, and we have some very deep oceans. Now, if you took the mountains and squished them flat and brought the deep seas and brought them up so that our earth was a perfect sphere, there's plenty of water to account for Noah's flood. In fact, the earth would be covered up to a depth of almost 2 miles deep in water. So again, plenty of water to account for Noah's flood. The Bible says that the flood covered all the land, including all the mountains. And that's what we find to be true. We find aquatic and marine fossils in sedimentary layers on the highest mountain ranges, including Mount Everest. You see, the evidence in the present demonstrates that these layers were once under oceans, and later the mountains were pushed up just as God's words described. In Psalms 104, it says the waters were standing above the mountains, and the mountains rose and the valleys sank down. There's lots of other things that point to a young earth and that these rock layers formed quickly via Noah's flood. These are folded rock layers. So if these layers represented millions of years, how can solid rock fold and maintain their layer conformity with no cracks or breaks? Now, a more plausible explanation is that all these layers were established in days or weeks in Noah's flood, and they were disturbed while they were still soft. So again, jury, which makes the most sense? This is a polystrate fossil, and it is one of many found throughout the world. The evidence is that the surrounding rock layers were deposited very quickly. There's no decomposition or erosion at the top of this tree trunk, supposedly millions of years after the first layer. If this tree waited millions of years to get covered, it would have rotten and fallen over for sure. And speaking of layers, we're taught that each thin layer of strata takes years to form. And in something like this huge 24-thick layer, that would result in about, millions of years. But I want to challenge that. So this is Mount St. Helens. It erupted on May 18th, 1980, and it lasted 9 hours. So less than a month later, it had another eruption, and this bottom layer that you see was the first 9 hours, and then this upper layer, they were all formed in 3 hours. So a total of 12 hours represents everything that you see here. So imagine what a flood could do in an entire year. Now, about 18 months later, there was a giant mud flow, and that created the very uppermost layer that you see in the slide. But it also carved out this huge canyon. It's 1/40th the size of Grand Canyon, 600 feet wide, 100 feet deep. Did this happen in millions of years? No, we were there to watch it. It happened in one day. Scientists were amazed, and it rocked their assumptions. Now, if we didn't observe this, we would have potentially seen all these layers and said, oh, that took millions of years to form, and this little tiny river, not a giant mud flow, is responsible for making this big canyon. But that would not be true. So now let's apply that to the Grand Canyon. There's lots of evidence that points to rapid deposition and rapid erosion, similar to what we saw in Mount St. Helens. You see, If from a Genesis perspective, the rock layers represent the order of deposition, and the fossils are simply the order of burial. The naturalist or the evolutionist would say that this is a record of millions of years of sedimentation, and it records evolving creatures in the rock layers. I think the biblical view makes the most sense of what we see. Now, discussing science, especially historical science, it really is a heart issue, and we should not be surprised by the evolutionary deception. 2 Peter 3:1-7 says, "Scoffers will come in the last days, following their own sinful desires, for they deliberately overlook this fact that the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished." The Bible predicted that people would deny Noah's flood. All right, historical science studies fossils. Now, Beau, hasn't it been proven that fossils take a long time to form? Well, would you believe me if I told you there might be another way to look at that? Yep, this is fun. So we're taught that fossils are made with a dinosaur dying, sinking intact to the bottom, slowly getting buried undisturbed, and then being fossilized over millions of years, and then waiting for us to either dig them up or for erosion to be discovered. Now, is that what we really observe today? What happens mostly when a fish or animal dies? Well, usually they float. So if you've ever watched a Discovery Channel video and you're looking at the ocean floor, isn't it just littered with intact creatures just waiting to be buried? No, not at all. It's perfectly clean usually. So what we observe when an animal dies is a food chain in action. Scavengers come, eat the body, even the skeleton. Rarely will bones even make it to the floor of the ocean or pond, and if it does, then it's probably scavenged as well. So what is a more plausible explanation for the abundant, well-preserved fossils that we see today? Well, I'll tell you a story about it, based on Genesis. So this is Freddy the fish. He's happily swimming along and encounters a cataclysmic event similar to Noah's flood, and he is instantly buried. The good news is he has a quick death, only to be discovered 4,500 years later as a fossil. Now, we already said this, modern labs can easily make fossils in less than a month. We've learned that under the conditions of lots of water, sediment, and pressure, fossils actually form quite quickly. Now, there's a ton of evidence for rapid burial versus being slowly covered by sediments. This are fossilized over 250 fish. They're all facing the same direction, and it looks like they're actively swimming as a school. This is ichthyosaur, and is an extinct animal, but significantly, what do you see what's happening here? It's giving birth. So this animal was buried rapidly, so rapid that it is snap frozen in time in the birth process. This does not fit the die of old age and sink slowly and get covered story. In fact, we see fossils of all stages of life, babies to adults. This fish, he didn't even get to finish lunch before he was buried. He was actively eating lunch. Now, we hear, don't fossils take millions of years to form? Well, this is a fossilized hat from New Zealand. It was buried in volcanic ash, and it evolved from a soft hat to a hard hat in 20 years. We have this teddy bear, again, under the right conditions, it turned to stone within 3 to 5 months. So, again, fossils happen and can happen quite quickly. Now, God is very consistent. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Science, however, has a long history of changing based on new evidence. This is Pakicetus. In 1983, he was a candidate of a transition animal from land to whales. You can see that he's streamlined. He's got legs that are on their way to becoming flippers. The only fossil evidence was just the shaded parts of the skull. The rest of the reconstruction was based on imagination. Years later, though, we found more skeleton. Again, more evidence, and the story changed. And this is what Pecasitas is today. He's really just a dog-sized rat. All right, so thanks for staying with me this long for this science class. Can you explain, or can you think of anything in the Bible that can explain huge numbers of dead creatures buried in massive rock layers deposited rapidly by water over all the continents, including Mount Everest? Yes, that's going to be Noah's flood from the Bible. Well, you cannot have it both ways. If Noah's flood really happened, then our world is only 6,000 years old. The Bible is real history. The Old Testament genealogies are real history. The fossil record is real history and confirms the events of the Bible, not evolution's fanciful story of millions of years. Our own Dr. Sarfati says it best. One can be confident that the evolutionary view of Earth history is wrong, and the record in the rocks and fossils makes much more sense in light of the Bible's account of creation, the fall, and the flood. You see, what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word. The Bible can be trusted on issues of salvation, but also historical science. Isn't it pretty exciting to know that there's so much evidence that supports the Bible, and we've really only scratched the surface today? So do you see yourself sharing this information? Do you find yourself that you want to learn more? Well, remember, most people believe in evolution because it's all they've ever been taught. What about the people in your neighborhood, your workplace, your children? Who's going to tell them about the evidence for creation? Is it going to be the school or TV? No, it's going to be you. So we are engaged in a battle for souls. We all need Jesus, and we need to know that the Bible can be trusted. Genesis is foundational to our ability to share the gospel effectively. Now, we've covered a lot today, but it really is just the tip of the iceberg. Do you or your family, your friends and family definitely have questions, and maybe some of you still have doubts. So I'm going to be returning home after this presentation, but you're remaining with your family and community to defend the faith. We want you to be prepared to have an answer as to why the Bible can be trusted in all matters. So you may be asking, well, where do I start? And our magazine, Creation Magazine, is one place. We already talked about our website. Our magazine is a simple way to equip yourself and your family. There's no paid advertising, and there's a 4-page Christian or children's section in all the magazines. So we're going to have some clipboards come around again and allow you to sign up either for a 1 or 2 year subscription. So I can now ask the volunteers to pass out the clipboards. Take this form, and you can receive your first issue today when you bring it out to the back. And you also get a digital version where you can share upon 5 devices if you don't want to read the magazine itself. If you do a 2-year subscription, you'll get 2 free DVDs. The first one is the Darwin documentary, and the second one, which you've already talked about today, is our Fallout documentary. And I also want to highlight a few other resources that you'll be able to find. One is our Creation Answers book, 60 of the most asked questions and very, very good answers. Things like carbon-14, distant starlight, the Ice Age, where did Cain get his wife? All these answers can be found in this book. It's a great way to evangelize using our products. This is a testimony that we get, and we get these all the time. This is Robert D. A few months ago, I started on my high school geology course, and my faith was weakened by the evolutionary arguments presented in it. A few months later, I received quite a number of your books for Christmas. I must say that these books, as well as the website, have greatly strengthened my faith. So again, these resources really work. I subscribe to the magazine, and I usually give away every issue. You can also sign up for a starter pack, and that's going to give you the Creation Answers book, Refuting Evolution, and also a DVD, Genesis and the Gospel Connection. Evolution's Achilles Heels features 15 PhD scientists. If you want a longer study, we have the Genesis Academy. You can use that for Sunday school or maybe a summer program. And if you want an even bigger study, this is brand new. The rock solid Bible curriculum It's good for a full year for like homeschool, or your church can do for, again, a longer time. So while the Creation Magazine subscription forms are making their rounds, I want to talk about a couple more examples. So one question that I've heard or statement is, doesn't scientific dating methods provide indisputable evidence for millions of years, maybe even billions of years? Well, let's challenge that. So there is a known eruption, and scientists took a sample from a volcanic lava dome, and they sent it to modern day laboratories to get using the potassium argon method to get dated. And again, this is all from basically the same rock. They got answers back from 350,000 years old to 2.8 million years old. Well, which one do you think was right? Actually, none of them. The rock was 10 years old. So all these samples were only 10 years old, and yet they came back with wildly different results. Now that's on a rock whose age we know. How bad do you think these radio isotope dates are on rocks of unknown age? So diamonds are supposedly the oldest substance on the earth. But guess what? They've got carbon-14 in them. And this is really strange because carbon-14 cannot last more than 100,000 years in any mineral. It will change out. So again, any diamond that you see has to be less than 100,000 years old, nowhere close to millions and millions of years. There's also a lot of evidence for a young Earth, and that includes new discoveries. So I'm going to give you a quick vignette about Dr. Mary Schweitzer. She's an evolutionist working at Montana State University, and she had a smelly T-Rex or a Tyrannosaurus Rex bone and had to break the bone in order to transport it. Her discovery was beyond belief. She found red blood cells in dinosaur bones. Now, Dr. Schweitzer's own words, if you take a blood sample and stick it on a shelf, you have nothing recognizable in about a week. So why would there be anything left in dinosaurs? And yet, this is what they found. They later dissolved the bony matrix and into the soft fibrous tissue, and they said it was flexible and resilient, and when stretched, it returned to its original shape. There were also transparent blood vessels, and they were able to squeeze out the contents. Absolutely amazing. Now, we would say that's pretty amazing, even being 4,500 years old, but 65 million years old? So Dr. Schweitzer said, I got goosebumps. It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. Yeah, it almost was. But of course, I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? Yes, how could they have survived that long indeed? All right, Romans 1:20 says, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So we can see God in the heavens, but it also points to a young solar system. And one of many examples of that are comets. Comets are made of ice, and every time they pass by the sun, they lose a little bit of their material. So a comet could theoretically orbit a maximum of 100,000 years before it would be completely disintegrated. So comets indicate a very young solar system. You see, we look forward to a time where God creates the new heavens and the new earth. In the new earth, there will be no more curse, no more death, no more decay. When God restores his creation to the perfect state, we expect this to be instantaneous, similar to the first time, not via millions of years of death, mutations, and suffering. You see, the Bible links the original Genesis creation account to the future perfect heaven and earth. In closing, let me remind you of this verse. Let's equip ourselves with the answers so the next time somebody asks us a question, we have a ready response. Let's be confident and show people that the Bible is true, starting with the very first verse. Now, I said there'd be a test. How can you find us? That's right, creation.com. Ah, super. Glad you remembered. All right, I will be in the back at the book tables to answer any questions and help out after the service. Thank you, Pastor Smith, for allowing me to speak in your church today. Take care. GoPro, stop recording.